Last year was a monstrous year for business acquisitions, and despite rising rates and a potential recession, it doesn't appear to be slowing down. Last week was as busy a week as I've ever had on the business acquisition front. And having strong business broker relationships is a great way to see these types of deals. And so in this episode, I'm going to provide 5 pieces of advice on how to create success with business brokers. First off, does your shop want to do business acquisitions? That's really the first thing you need to ask yourself because not all do. These deals often have limited collateral and buyers don't always have direct industry experience. They can span a wide variety of industries, so if your bank has a bunch of industry restrictions, that could get tough. But if your shop is okay with all of that and they'll do it in a way that's competitive in the market, and that's key, then you're off to the races. Now, you have to understand a business broker's job is to list good businesses for sale. And this is not easy. And they often don't get paid until the business sells, which is usually like a year later. So by the time the SBA lender is starting the process with the buyer, there's already been like maybe 9 months of work on the business broker's end, sometimes even more. And they cannot afford to have an incompetent lender come in and screw things up at the last minute. So with that in mind, let's talk about the top 5 tips for working with business brokers. Tip number 1, it's all about execution. The broker just ran the ball 70 yards, 3-4 yards at a time, right down the middle. They're approaching the red zone. They can see the touchdown. The last thing they want to do is throw the pass to a lender and have them fumble. So what does execution mean? Well, it starts with your support team. There are just some things the BDO doesn't have control over. And if your shop is slow or having capacity issues, it's going to be really hard to come through for these brokers. But having a healthy shop is just the starting point. Execution means doing what you say you're going to do. You've got to establish trust. Your name needs to mean something in the market. So when they see your name, they think, okay, this guy gets it done. Execution is about having a sense of urgency and being proactive. And if you can do this right from beginning to end, then honestly, you should be charging a premium because it is so rare in our industry. Tip number 2, communication. This is very simple. If the broker sends you the deal, they deserve to know exactly what's going on at all times. So you should be constantly communicating to the broker. And if the broker is having to track you down and ask for updates, you done messed up. Now, I'm not saying you have to call the broker every single day because, that would get a little excessive, but it would help if you educated the broker on the timeline of your underwriting process, for example, so that they know if and when they need to check back in with you. So if you're expecting an approval in 2 weeks, on the 5th, you tell them that, you can be sure that that broker is going to put that date on their calendar. And if they don't hear from you on the 5th, that's a huge problem. Now, by the way, did you notice these first 2 tips have nothing to do with rates or terms? And just like the broker, by the way, the buyer is also looking for execution and communication. Buyers often go through a very long journey to get to this point, and sometimes years, and so closing the transaction, moving briskly, all these things are just important to them. On to tip number 3, seller notes. Huge topic when it comes to SBA lending for business acquisitions. Sellers are a great way for buyers to make sure that the seller has some skin in the game when it comes to making this transaction and the transition a success. So buyers like them and will often try to negotiate having some seller financing into the transaction. And not only do buyers like them, but lenders also like having them in for similar reasons. But the question is, does the lender require them? Requiring a seller note is a big decision because the lender is ultimately requiring something that the borrower cannot provide without the seller's consent, of course. Now, think back to how this deal originated. The broker who sent you this deal earned the right to list this business. And now a lot of brokers will tell the seller, hey, bank might need you to hold a 10% note, so get ready, and get the seller comfortable with that idea. And they're doing this early on when they're securing the listing. But some sellers might just be dead set against it. In any event, if there's a signed LOI with no seller note, and now the lender is requiring a seller note, even though the seller doesn't want to, and the buyer's okay with proceeding anyway, then the lender is making the broker's job much harder than it has to be. And honestly, it might be easier for that broker or buyer to just find a new lender than try to convince the seller to do something that they don't want to do. So my advice, if your shop absolutely requires seller notes, be very upfront with the broker community about that. Tip number 4, offer to pre-qualify listings. Pre-qualifying a broker's listing helps them show potential buyers that the business is financeable with SBA debt and what the terms might look like. Pre-qualifying a listing would involve reviewing the seller's tax returns, financials, running some DSCR calculations, and reviewing the SIM. And it's a great way to add value. They'll add the pre-qual letter to the package so that buyers can see it and potentially use you for the financing. It may require a lot of work, and you may only get 1 out of 4 deals that you pre-qual. I just made that number up, but it's the best way to get your foot in the door. You can even take it a step further by offering a pre-qual potential buyers, because some brokers want to make sure that the potential buyers that they're speaking to are qualified, and they might send them to a banker to check out and kind of pre-qualify them up to a certain purchase price. Finally, tip number 5, have the hard conversations up front. In other words, don't kick the can down the road because you're afraid of scaring the broker off. Because at the end of the day, you need to be honest and transparent with the broker. And if that means losing the deal, so be it. It's not worth your relationship in the long term. Let me tell you a story. I had a broker reach out a few years back and ask me to do a pre-qual. I asked him for certain information which I knew could make or break the deal, and he pushed back. He didn't want to bug the seller, and he felt that I should just simply be able to provide the pre-qual letter because this other bank, can provide the pre-qual letter, and just he wanted to carry on with trying to find a buyer for this listing. So I pushed back, and I told him that we want to take the time to understand the deal and iron out the wrinkles up front so that when a buyer does go under LOI, we can move forward with greater certainty and fewer surprises. Because no one's getting paid for a pre-qual. We have to actually close it. And so I turned that broker from being annoyed at me to saying, you know what, that makes a lot of sense. So there you have it. Those are my tips for working with business brokers. It's all about execution, communication, problem solving, flexibility, and transparency. And if you can get good at most of those things, you're going to have a lot of success in this space. All right, that's it for this week. Don't forget to subscribe to the podcast so you never miss an episode of The Art of SBA Lending. And if you have any feedback or suggestions, email me at ray@artofsba.com. Until next time, ta-ta.